The dam at Vajont held. The mountain did not. And before the water left the reservoir, the danger was already inside the company's own files. That is the first problem with the way Vajont is remembered. It is often called a dam disaster. But after the disaster, the concrete wall was still standing in the gorge. Longarone, below it, was not. In 1959, Edoardo Semenza photographed the north slope of Mount Toc and marked what he believed was the old edge of a landslide. Semenza was a young geologist, connected to the dam project by both family and profession. He was not a distant critic looking in from outside. His reading entered the same technical world that was preparing the valley for water. By June 1960, that reading had become part of a geological report. The report did not predict the exact night. It did not predict the exact speed of the collapse. It did not name the exact height of the wave that would later pass over the dam. A cautious reading says something narrower and more damaging to the comfort that followed. It identified the wrong object of confidence. Not only the dam wall, the mountain. Vajont was not a simple story of concrete failure. The wall held. The slope moved. The reservoir carried that movement into the valley below. A structure could succeed in one sense and still belong to a system that failed in the only sense that mattered. The Vajont Dam was a high, thin, double-curvature arch dam built between 1957 and 1960 in a narrow alpine gorge. A double-curvature arch dam is curved both horizontally and vertically, so water pressure is pushed into the rock walls on either side. It was a confident kind of structure, slender, precise, modern. That confidence drew attention toward the wall. The wall could be calculated. The wall could be inspected. The wall could be photographed as proof that engineering had mastered the gorge. But Vajont was never only a wall. It was a reservoir placed against a mountain with its own history. It was water raised and lowered beside fractured ground. It was a power project inside a landscape that had already moved before. Sade was not building a monument. It was building a water and electricity machine. Vajont belonged to a network of basins, tunnels, levels, authorizations, and production needs. Water was not just stored there. It was managed, transferred, raised, and lowered for power. That does not require a dramatic theory of motive. The record is enough. The reservoir level mattered because the system needed water. Decisions about the mountain were made inside that operating reality. Above and beside the reservoir were Erto and Casso. Below the dam was Longarone. That geography divided knowledge. Erto and Casso were close enough to see changes around the basin. Muddy water, rumbling, tremors, cracks on the slope. Longarone saw the dam, the visible object of both danger and reassurance. The mayor of Erto Casso became a civic witness in the record. His letters were not technical papers, but they carried evidence from a community living beside the movement. He wrote about muddy waters, rumbling, tremors, anxiety, danger, and the need to put people in safety. The people around the reservoir did not control the water level. They did not decide which reports were sent upward. They could not inspect the full technical file. They lived beside the evidence, while others decided what the evidence meant. One village could see the cracks. Another could only see the dam. 3 tracks now run beside one another. The geological track is made of field readings, photographs, fissures, control points, movement measurements, and later technical reanalysis. The operating track is made of reservoir levels, model tests, letters, authorizations, commissions, company decisions, state control, and later, prosecution. The community track is made of warnings from below, late calls, memory, testimony, and the difficulty of carrying a disaster that many people had not been given the means to understand. One track measured millimeters, one moved paper, one carried fear without authority. Vajont formed where all 3 failed to meet in time. In the earlier regulatory frame, a dam project could focus heavily on the dam itself, on its abutments, and on the permeability of the basin. Abutments are the rock sides into which an arch dam transfers its load. If those rock supports fail, the wall can fail with them. That was a real engineering question. But another question was waiting on the slope. What happens when a reservoir is placed beside a mountain that may already be a landslide mass? The later engineering geology literature describes the first detailed geological studies as taking place in 1959 and 1960 by Giudici and Semenza. It also records that designers still concluded a deep-seated landslide was unlikely. That was the blind spot. The dam's strength encouraged a category error. Confidence in the concrete quietly spread to the mountain beside it. A wall can be brilliantly designed and still create a reservoir beside a slope that cannot be trusted. A dam wall is an object. A reservoir is a system. The system included the mountain. There had already been a warning from another place in Sadi's world. In March 1959, at Pontassé, slope stability in Sadi reservoirs became an explicit concern. Pontassé made slope failure imaginable inside the company system. Then Semenza's photographs made an ancient slide visible at Vajont. A photograph became a line on a mountain. A line became a hypothesis. A hypothesis became a report. The report should have changed the authority of every later decision. Semenza read the north slope of Mount Toc as the remains of an old collapse. The shape of the slope, the fractured zones, the old valley fill, the line near Pian della Pozza, none of these were dramatic signs in themselves. They were geological signs. They required a reader who understood that mountains can preserve old movement in their form, and that old movement can matter again when water changes pressure and drainage at the base. By June 1960, the Giudici-Semenza report concluded that an ancient landslide mass lay on Mount Toc and could move again with the creation of the reservoir. This was not rumor from outside the project. It came from geological work connected to the project itself. Here is the warning in its most exact form. Before the final reservoir existed, Sade's own geology had put in writing that the mountain might be reawakened by the water plan beside it. That statement did not need to predict everything to matter. According to the Fondazione Vajont chronology, the study warned that water could reactivate movement with unpredictable consequences, and it was not submitted to the control authorities. The warning did not disappear, it became internal. The report did not settle every technical question. It did not prove the final acceleration mechanism. It did not tell operators that on October 9, 1963, at 2239, a mass of roughly 260 to 270 million cubic meters would enter the reservoir. The record does not say the final event was known in every detail, but after that report, the mountain could no longer honestly be treated as an ordinary slope beside an ordinary reservoir. There was room to debate mechanism. There was room to debate speed. There was room to debate scale. There was no longer room to call the danger imaginary. Then the mountain moved before the disaster. On November 4, 1960, a smaller slide, about 700,000 cubic meters, fell into the reservoir after an M-shaped crack opened across the slope. It did not destroy the valley. It did something more specific. It turned the theory into a physical event. A slope marked in photographs had moved. A slope discussed in a report had entered the water. The reservoir had now produced the kind of interaction the warning had described. Semenza later told an examining judge that the unstable mass was about 2 kilometers long and on the order of 250 million cubic meters. That estimate should not be sharpened into false precision. The record carries large estimates, not a perfect preview. But the scale matters. It placed the suspected mass in the same broad order as the disaster that later occurred. After the 1960 slide, SADE lowered the reservoir and decided to build a bypass tunnel. A bypass tunnel is a route designed to let water pass even if a landslide cuts the reservoir in two. That decision is one of the clearest facts in the file. A tunnel was now being built for a landslide large enough to split the lake. The danger had become part of engineering planning. But once danger enters planning, it can be made to look controlled. It can be converted into levels, assumptions, models, safety margins, and operating procedures. That conversion is necessary. It is also where a warning can lose its force. At NOVE, model tests translated Mount Toc into a testable form. Gravel, boards, timing assumptions, reservoir levels, and waves measured at scale. A model can answer only the questions built into it. That does not make the modelers foolish. It makes the assumptions decisive. The 1961 model tests assumed landslide masses of 20 to 40 million cubic meters, possibly moving in separate parts, with fall times slower than the final event. The final slide was much larger and much faster. That difference is the space between a model and a disaster. According to the Fondazione Vajont chronology, Getty's July 1962 model report treated a reservoir level of 700 meters as safe for a catastrophic landslide, but also recommended that downstream wave effects be examined. The same chronology says the report was not delivered to the control authorities. The model therefore produced two things. It produced a number that could be treated as a boundary, and it preserved downstream questions that had not been finished. The institutional danger lay in which part became powerful. 700 meters became permission. By 1962 and early 1963, the reports were no longer vague. In July and August 1962, official reports recommended a prompt geological survey of fissures and motions. The Dams Department did not answer. In January 1963, Bertolisi reported that monitored motions were close to a critical point. A control point is a measured point fixed to the ground so movement can be tracked over time. When control points accelerate, a slope is speaking in numbers. Those numbers do not give every future detail. They do remove stillness as an explanation. The mayor's warnings describe the same system from below. According to the Fondazione Vajont chronology, the mayor of Urto Caso warned in July and September 1963 about muddy waters, rumbling, tremors, anxiety, and danger. He asked that people be put in safety. The chronology also notes that one ministry archive had no trace of the September letter. That archive fact should stay what it is. It is not, by itself, proof of malicious destruction. It is an absence in the paperwork of a disaster. The more important point is already visible without speculation. Technical warnings and community warnings were moving in parallel. One came from instruments and geological interpretation. One came from people living beside the slope. Neither produced safety in time. The number 700 now mattered more than it should have. A reservoir level of 700 meters could sound like a clean line between danger and control. Below it, the implication was that even a catastrophic slide could be managed. But the report that made the level usable had also pointed toward downstream effects that were not complete. A number can guide judgment. It can also replace it. The reservoir was operated inside a system of authorizations and drawdowns. Reservoir drawdown means lowering the water level. On paper, the process could look controlled. The level could be recorded. The drawdown could be ordered. The files could show procedure. On the slope, the ground was accelerating. From September 2nd to October 9th, control points recorded movement increasing from millimeters to as much as 200 millimeters on the final day. The mountain was no longer only the subject of a report. It was no longer only the subject of a model. It was moving in real time. October 8th. Bertolisi wrote of the seriousness of the situation. October 9th. The report was delivered locally. Then it was sent to Rome by regular mail. That detail is hard because it is ordinary. A report moved through normal channels while the mountain had left normal behavior behind. By then, instruments were almost no longer necessary. Workers and staff could see the movement. Cracks widened, trees fell, road deformation blocked access. Late roadblock measures were taken. The slope had become visible to ordinary sight. The clock was no longer administrative. On the last day, the three witness tracks converged. The geological track showed widening cracks, falling trees, blocked roads, and control points moving faster than before. The slope had moved from field reading to report, from report to crack, from crack to instrument record, from instrument record to visible deformation. The operating track moved through calls, closures, roadblocks, requests, and reassurance. There were measures, there was concern, there were late decisions, but they did not become evacuation for the people below the dam. At 2200, Rittmeyer called Bayadine to express worry. The versions differ about the operator's question regarding Longarone. The record does not settle that exchange into one clean line of dialogue, and it should not be forced into one. The uncertainty belongs in the case. What can be said is enough. Late that night, the system still had not turned its knowledge into safety for Longarone. The community track is the hardest to narrate without pretending to know too much. People below the dam did not have the full technical file. Some feared the dam, some were reassured. Some could only interpret the danger through the visible object above them, the concrete wall. Urto and Casso had seen signs on the slope. Longarone was downstream from the structure that appeared to be the danger. The danger that mattered most was higher and less visible, in the reservoir and in the mountain beside it. The record does not allow reconstruction of every household's final decision. It does not allow invented last conversations. It does not turn private fear into evidence where evidence is missing. What it shows is an imbalance. The people at risk did not possess the same information as the institutions managing the reservoir. The geological report was not theirs to read. The model assumptions were not theirs to challenge. The operating level was not theirs to set. At 2239 on October 9, 1963, Mount Toc fell as a single mass into the Vajont reservoir. The recorded slide mass is around 260 to 270 million cubic meters, depending on source. The water went two ways. Upstream, the wave struck places near the basin. Downstream, it rose over the dam and moved toward Longarone in nearby villages. Overtopping means water passes over the crest of a dam. At Vajont, that word has to be heard carefully. The wave passed over the wall. The wall did not collapse. The concrete structure remained standing, undamaged or only slightly damaged in the records. The water did not need the dam to fail. That is why the usual shorthand is not enough. A dam disaster suggests a broken wall, a failed structure, a sudden release because concrete or earthworks gave way. Vajont was different. The wall survived. The reservoir system did not. The fact that carries the scene is simpler than any graphic description. According to the Fondazione Vajont record, 1,919 people died, and the dam was described as the only human artifact in the area to resist the wave. The wall remained. The communities below did not. 2 days later, on October 11, 1963, the state set up a commission to determine the recent and remote causes. The wording matters. Recent causes alone would not be enough. The final movement on one night could explain timing. It could not explain the years before it. It could not explain the reports, the model tests, the letters, the control points, the internal knowledge, the level decisions, and the late failure to move people out of danger. The question had to move backward. What was known before the wave? Who knew it? Where did that knowledge travel? Where did it stop? In testimony gathered 3 decades later, survivors and witnesses still circle the difficulty of remembering and transmitting the event. That kind of testimony must be used carefully. It is memory, not a technical instrument. It comes with time between the disaster and the telling. But it shows that Vajont did not end when the water drained away. It continued as a problem of speech, silence, dispute, and inheritance. The people left after the wave had to rebuild more than a town. They had to carry a memory that many found difficult to speak about and difficult to pass on without distortion. Memory had to hold what administration had failed to prevent. The Italian archival record describes a criminal trial file as a physical landscape of its own. 259 boxes covering 1963 to 1971, with rock samples, model material, seismograms, photographs, negatives, and films. A disaster that began with a mountain became an archive. That archive exists because the sentence, "the mountain fell," was never sufficient. Mountains fall. But at Vajont, the mountain had been photographed, studied, measured, modeled, discussed, and named in records before it fell. After that, nature and the human system could not be separated cleanly. The legal question became a fight over meaning. Was Vajont an unforeseeable natural landslide? Was it only a failure to warn at the last moment? Or was it a predictable disaster inside an engineered system? In 1968, investigating judge Mario Fabbri issued prosecution against multiple SADE and official figures. The prosecution did not place the event back inside nature. It named technical and official responsibility. The mountain remained central, but it was no longer allowed to stand alone as the only actor in the record. The first instance judgment in 1969 narrowed the blame. It sentenced Biadin and Violin for not warning and evacuating, but did not acknowledge predictability of the landslide. That distinction is decisive. Failure to warn can leave the mountain as a sudden external event. Predictability pulls the earlier file into the center. It asks whether the disaster began at 2239 or whether it had already entered the system years earlier, when the mountain was read, described, and then managed as if uncertainty still made it safe. Appeal changed the shape of the record. In 1970, the appeal found Biadin and Sensidoni guilty of culpable landslide, flood, and manslaughter. Cassation changed it again. Cassation is the highest court of review in this legal sequence. In 1971, it found Biadin and Sensidoni guilty of aggravated flood, including predictability of the event, including the landslide, and manslaughter. That did not make the science simple. It did make the old shorthand harder to defend. The longer reform is not one rule in one code. The Italian archival record describes the Vajont trial archive, entered into UNESCO Memory of the World in 2023, as documentation of how humans can cause catastrophe by modifying natural equilibrium for economic profit. In engineering practice, Vajont took a place in the history of engineering geology, reservoir slope assessment, and the obligation to treat slopes as active parts of dam safety. The later engineering geology literature describes the failure as generally agreed to have occurred along clay bands within the limestone mass. Clay bands are weaker layers that can influence how a large rock mass slides. But the same literature still preserves questions about the sudden acceleration. Better explanation after the fact is not the same as perfect foresight before the fact. That is where the case has to stay honest. The record does not say every final detail was knowable in advance. It does not say the exact speed, exact wave, and exact final trigger were all sitting plainly in one document. Modern engineering geology can explain more than the 1963 operators could, but it still treats the final acceleration as technically complex. Unknown does not mean safe. That is the hinge of Vajont. My read is cautious. Vajont was not predictable in every final detail, but it was predictable enough that the claim, "We did not know the mountain was dangerous," cannot survive the file. The myth says dam disaster. The record says something harder. A dam that held, a slope that moved, a court history that eventually had to use the language of predictability. That difference is not semantic. It changes where responsibility is allowed to go. If Vajont is only a broken dam, the question stays at the wall. If it is only a natural landslide, responsibility dissolves into the mountain. But if the wall held, the slope moved, and the system had already read the danger, then the failure sits in the space between knowledge and action. That space appears again and again. A photograph became a hypothesis. A hypothesis became a report. A report became internal knowledge. A moving slope became a model. A model produced a number. A number became operating confidence. Community fear became letters. Letters became archive traces, and in at least one case, an archive absence. Control points became measurements. Measurements became urgency, too late. Afterward, the criminal file became boxes. The judgments became a record. The disaster became testimony, memory institutions, and a permanent place in engineering geology and reservoir slope assessment. But the people below the reservoir needed that translation before 2239, not after. Return to the beginning, before the wave and before the final night. In 1959, Edoardo Semenza read the north slope of Mount Toc as the edge of an old landslide. In June 1960, the Giudici Semenza report placed that reading into the file. According to the Fondazione Vajont chronology, the report warned that water could reactivate movement with unpredictable consequences and was not submitted to the control authorities. The mountain was already present in the record before it entered the reservoir. The dam remains in the gorge. It still answers the wrong question. It shows that the wall could stand. It does not explain why the warning failed to become action. The open question is not whether Mount Toc warned them. It is how a system can read the warning, measure it, model it, prosecute it after the fact, and still fail to act before the water leaves the reservoir.